Kolomoki is a civic ceremonial center located in southwestern Georgia. Though the site was occupied throughout the Middle and Late Woodland periods, its most intensive occupation appears to have occurred near the turn of the 7th century AD. Around this time, Kolomoki's village appears to have ballooned from a roughly 400-meter-long U-shaped configuration to the form of a circular settlement nearly a kilometer in diameter, referred to as the outer village in this figure. In general form, the arcuate midden at Kolomoki was similar to other Swift Creek and Weeden Island ring middens common to the region. In size, however, Kolomoki's village dwarfed its contemporaries. Previous research by Martin Menz identified discrete clusters of lithic raw materials within the arcs of the outer village areas, which he interpreted as the potential locations of groups of households. As Menz's research was largely confined to the distributional patterns of lithic materials, his findings begged the question, are there other artifact categories representing clustered areas within Kolomoki's village? If so, do clusters of different artifact categories co-occur spatially? Are there notable quantitative differences between artifact assemblages from areas containing clusters that may be indicative of socioeconomic disparities within Kolomoki's village community? Employing the data from previous site-wide sampling by Thomas Pluckhahn and partially reanalyzed by Menz, in this presentation, we identify and characterize additional clusters of material culture in an attempt to shed further light on internal organization within the arcuate community at Kolomoki. Kolomoki is located within the lower Chattahoochee River Valley, roughly 12 kilometers east of the Chattahoochee River itself. The site's location within the interior appears to make it one among few examples of a ring midden removed from the coast at the time. Despite the distance, ceramic paddle match and provenance studies by Neil Wallace and colleagues demonstrate that Kolomoki was well connected to, and probably a major influence on, the coastal communities and surrounding populations. Similar to several of the coastal sites, Kolomoki contains two circular middens, apparently the result of a radical restructuring of the village plan sometime around AD 700. The site significantly departs from those in the Panhandle and elsewhere in the region in terms of scale and monumentality via its oversized village plans, many mounds, and enclosure walls. The socio-political organizations at Kolomoki also likely contrasted from those at the surrounding ring sites. William Sears, who conducted excavations at Kolomoki in the mid-20th century, believed the site to be a Mississippian period expression, what Sears described as the head of a priest state. Based primarily on his work in the two burial mounds, and with a hefty dose of ethnographic analogy, Sears envisioned the occupants of Kolomoki in a manner akin to the 18th century Natchez, a chieftain-like society characterized by heavy social stratification, a reliance on maize agriculture, and mortuary rituals involving human sacrifice. However, Sears's interpretations seem to have been based nearly entirely on his excavations in the burial mounds, and subsequent work by Thomas Pluckhahn largely refuted his characterizations of the site. Pluckhahn's testing of the village areas verified what many in the archaeological community had long suspected. Kolomoki was actually much older than Sears envisioned, instead dating primarily to the Middle and Late Woodland periods. Further, Pluckhahn demonstrated that Kolomoki's village areas yielded fairly redundant and mundane artifact assemblages, inconsistent with the idea of a heavily stratified population. Instead, Pluckhahn considered the site to have been occupied by a community of around several hundred people that participated in corporate strategies of organization and emphasized an egalitarian ethos through communal mound construction and ritual events. In his analysis of the site, Pluckhahn also analyzed the village midden remains as indicators for duration of occupation through density and ubiquity measures. Characterizations based on these measures by Pluckhahn suggested that the southern village area may have been a location of less permanent residency, as opposed to the year-round occupations in the site's northern village arc. Further support for seasonal occupation in the south was found during our subsequent work within the site's previously little investigated southern village area. Specifically, while macrobotanicals recovered from future context along the southern village arc expressed no shortage of taxa harvested throughout the spring and summer, autumn and winter resources are virtually absent from the assemblage. This contrasts starkly with the botanicals recovered from light fractions in areas along the northern village arc, where taxa available during the spring and summer are also present, but the assemblage is dominated by massed resources. Likewise, comparison of pit and post feature densities and volumes also suggests differences pertaining to the permanence of settlement along the northern and southern village areas. Excavations along the northern arc produce 2 times as many features as those along the southern arc. The northern arc also produced higher numbers of post molds as reflected in the measures of density and proportion of this feature type. Interestingly, excavations along the southern arc produced higher frequencies of pit features, many of which assumingly represent storage facilities relative to the north. On average, these features also appear to be larger in the south, as demonstrated by measures of both volume and area. The higher densities of post molds within the north suggest that this area was more intensively occupied than the investigated areas along the southern arc. Conversely, the high capacity for storage within the south could be another indication of less permanent, more seasonally based residency. As alluded to above, Menz recently conducted a reanalysis of the lithic materials generated by Pluckhahn's site-wide grid. His research sought to investigate intra-community differences in terms of technology and raw materials, with the aim of identifying different communities of practice. In Menz's study, disparities between the northern and southern outer village areas were also evidenced through disproportionate concentrations of coastal plain chert in the northern village arc, while the distribution of milky quartz parallels this pattern in the south. Complementing these opposing clusters of raw materials are differences in lithic reduction strategies. Chert debris along the area of the northern arc exhibit high densities of late stage debris, while manufacturing industries along the southern arc are characterized by expedient flake and core technology. Menz also noted that lithic materials appeared to occur in localized clusters along the site's outer village arcs, which he interpreted as the locations of activities associated with groups of households. Localized concentrations of specific classes of artifacts, including Weeden Island elite types, have also been identified at other ring middens such as McKeithen, Hare Hammock, and Strange's Ring, interpreted as the locations of segregated activities or segments of the population with differential access to particular wares. The primary data employed in this presentation were derived from Pluckhahn's sampling program carried out in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Pluckhahn collected samples from 1,309 locations, consisting of 1,080 30-centimeter diameter shovel tests and 225 4-meter in diameter dog leash surface collections. The vast majority of Pluckhahn's samples are separated by approximately 20-meter intervals, though gaps in some areas of the grid, mostly in the southwestern section, are present. Altogether, these samples produced over 5,000 ceramic sherds and nearly 3,000 pieces of flake stone, affording a considerable data set for site-wide comparative analysis. As previously stated, lithic materials from these samples were recently reanalyzed by Menz using more fine-grained categories. This presentation utilizes the ceramic data generated by Pluckhahn and the lithic data reanalyzed by Menz. In order to facilitate comparisons, I aggregated the individual ceramic categories into the broader groups of plain ceramics, Swift Creek ceramics, Weeden Island series ceramics, excluding Swift Creek, and other ceramics. Artifact categories were first mapped using graduated symbols in order to visually inspect their distributions. Next, I employed ArcMap spatial analyst tools, including the cluster and outlier analysis and the hotspot analysis, to identify localized concentrations of various artifact categories. These tools locate spatial concentrations based on weighted features. All weights assigned to features represent the counts of a given artifact category recovered from each sample location. So simple visual inspections of the graduated symbols maps reveal intriguing differences in the distributions of the various artifact categories. Perhaps most interesting within the ceramic maps is the relatively segregated distributions of Weeden Island series ceramics, bottom left map, most obviously apparent along the southern portion of the site's village areas, where most of these scatters are separated by gaps of around 150 meters, but also discernible in the northern village areas as well. Consistent with Menz's observations, coastal plain chert, top left map, appears most heavily concentrated in the northernmost area of the northern village arc, while milky quartz, bottom map, is largely restricted to the south. The results of the cluster and outlier analysis reveal statistically significant concentrations of various categories of artifacts on multiple scales. As Menz suggests, and as might be expected based on the graduated symbols maps, artifacts appear in discrete clustered areas both along and between the site's village arcs. The only ceramic category that failed to reveal any clustering was the other ceramics category, bottom right map. Instead, some of these samples register as outliers, likely due to their altogether low quantities found across the site. Both plain ceramics, top left map, and Swift Creek ceramics, top right map, appear in patches of discrete clusters primarily towards the northern and eastern margins of the outer village areas, while clusters of Weeden Island series ceramics, bottom left map, appear more evenly dispersed as a combination of clusters and outliers across the site's village areas. Lithic raw materials also exhibit notable patterns of clustering. As suggested by the graduated symbols maps, coastal plain chert, top left map, is primarily concentrated into a large clustered area along the northernmost margins of the northern village arc. Clear quartz, top right map, also exhibits dense concentrations along the northern arc, but also appears in localized clusters and outliers in several areas across the site. Finally, milky quartz, bottom map, is predominantly concentrated in two large areas along the southernmost margins of the site. Unsurprisingly, given the similar objectives of the tools, the locations of statistically significant hotspots largely match the concentrated areas identified by the cluster and outlier analysis tool. In these maps, each sample location yielding artifacts belonging to the categories of other ceramics and milky quartz register as hotspots, likely due to the altogether limited numbers of these artifacts recovered from the site. Given the general close correspondence between the segregated distribution of Weeden Island series ceramics and the collective locations of various clusters and hotspots, I designated 14 areas as good candidates for potential groups of households for comparison based on these distributions. It should be noted that the designated locations do not depict all of the clustered areas in the previous slides, though the majority are represented. The Weeden Island clusters were also chosen as they presumably represent a relatively narrower window of time relative to the other ceramic types. The 14 areas were created using the Future to Point tool, which created centroids from multi-point selections of sample locations. I then merged all the centroids into a single layer and produced 60-meter buffers around these points. This resulted in 14 areas with no overlapping samples. Sample locations intersecting these areas were then used to generate descriptive statistics of artifact categories for these locations. Finally, I divided the 14 areas into 3 groups for comparison: the northern arc, the central portion of the ring, and the southern arc. I also split these areas into the groups of near mound and not near mound based on their intersection with a 100-meter buffer from a given mound. This table provides basic descriptive statistics for the buffer areas, which exhibit some notable variability in artifact totals between areas. However, with a few exceptions, relative proportions of artifact categories are fairly similar, consistent with the impression of relatively redundant assemblages across the site. This would seem to fit well with the notion of similar activities taking place within these areas, though differing in terms of intensity or duration. Comparisons of the buffer samples grouped by site areas indicate that on average, ceramic densities grade from higher values in the north to lower values toward the south. Lithic densities are generally highest in buffer areas along the northern and southern village arcs and less so in areas within the central ring. Comparisons of near mound buffer areas with those further from mound shows that on average, the bulk of material culture within these locations are concentrated away from the mounds. The relative proportions of buffers by site areas indicate that on average, groups in the south likely incorporate slightly higher percentages of plain and Weeden Island ceramics into their daily activities relative to their contemporaries residing in the northern village sections. The only artifact category that occurs on average in higher proportions in near mound areas is clear quartz. That this raw material type might have been more heavily associated with areas relatively near to mounds is supported by the high percentage of this artifact category also present within the central ring group. As alluded to in the background section, we have also collectively excavated a total of 28 test units, mostly 1x2s, as well as 4 larger block excavations in various areas across Kolomoki's village. While these excavation units were placed irrespective of the analyses just reviewed, some of the information gathered from the excavation units can help inform the results from the site grid data. Support for the notion of relatively segregated artifact concentrations are indicated by the locations of our units that yielded the lowest artifact densities, the majority of which are positioned between or on the periphery of the buffer areas. The most dramatic example of this comes from a string of test units along the northern village arc, While the two highlighted test units yielded less than 40 artifacts per square meter each, the units immediately adjacent to these produced over 700 artifacts per square meter. Perhaps the biggest departures from the grid data are two units that yielded relatively dense artifact assemblages in locations where no artifact concentrations are evident within the site-wide grid. Generally speaking, relative proportions from excavation units are also more variable than those from the characterizations of buffer areas. Finally, the remains of a semi-subterranean house were discovered along the northern village arc in a position between two of the buffer areas. While the Swift Creek ceramic cluster was identified in this area by the cluster and outlier tool, this area did not receive a buffer due to the lack of an associated Weeden Island scatter within its immediate vicinity. One potential explanation for this mismatch is that refuse may have been disposed in areas slightly away from houses. Another limiting factor in this analysis is the unknown extent to which earlier Midden material, presumably extracted from the site's earlier inner village area, may have been used as fill in the site's enclosure walls, which generally co-occur with the northern and southern outer village arcs. Clearly, further work, such as closer interval shovel testing or additional targeted excavation units, are needed in order to more accurately characterize the concentrated areas identified in this presentation. Still, the analyses of the material generated by Pluckhahn's site-wide grid indicate that various categories of artifacts do co-occur in relatively discrete clusters within village areas across the site, suggesting that these areas may indeed be good indicators for the general footprints of groups of households. Though further work is needed, this remains a notable point, as the organization of Swift Creek and Weeden Island settlements are not well understood. However, Kolomoki is not necessarily representative of the average Swift Creek or Weeden Island settlement. Relative to its contemporaries, the scale of Kolomoki's village areas is unrivaled. While Menz originally interpreted these areas as evidence for the presence of multiple corporate groups, possibly based on extended households, lineages, or clans, if the segregated distributions of Weeden Island pottery are viewed as very general indicators of individual domestic units, then the majority of these Weeden Island scatters alone are in keeping with the average size of entire Swift Creek and Weeden Island villages elsewhere in the region. While the social groupings within the outer village may have been organized into discrete occupational clusters, these groups are also part of the larger collective forming Kolomoki's village ring. Why Kolomoki's inhabitants, like their coastal counterparts, adhered to a circular social arrangement ultimately remains an open question. However, several scholars have acknowledged the panoptic qualities afforded by ring settlements, which may have been particularly useful for regulating social practices at sites such as Kolomoki, where at least a segment of the population appears to have only resided at the site on a seasonal basis. Life in the round is also frequently interpreted by archaeologists as potential means to reinforce group cohesion. Though, as Mike Rousseau has noted, circular settlements may also represent significant differences via the relative positions within their arrangements. In this sense, the concept of Kolomoki's village as a sociogram is an attractive one, especially with regard to the contrasting permanence of residency between the two village arcs. When considering that the probable source location of the southern clustered milky quartz is based to the southwest of the site in the Citronelle Formation, that the flow of ceramics originating from Kolomoki has a decidedly southward orientation, and that the southern village arc appears to have been a location of seasonally based residency, these characteristics provide tantalizing suggestions of a sociographic base for the village plan. Consistent with previous assessments by Pluckhahn and Menz, the analyses above suggest that social inequality in terms of variety and differences of material culture was not very pronounced among those residing at the site, at least certainly not to the extent that Sears had envisioned. However, it does seem likely that some residential groups may have had a monopoly on access to certain resources, such as lithic raw materials, as indicated by the considerably dense concentrations of chert in two of the buffer areas along the northern village arc. A similar story may have been playing out in the south with milky quartz, although the altogether low quantities of this artifact category perhaps implies group preference rather than economic control. In summary, our GIS analyses identified discrete clusters of material culture within the village areas of the pre-contact settlement of Kolomoki. In several cases, variable categories of artifacts were revealed to be concentrated within the same general vicinities, interpreted as the potential locations of individual social groupings within the village areas. Basic quantitative comparisons of 14 clustered locations indicated subtle differences between domestic areas, primarily between the northern and southern sections of Kolomoki's outer village arcs. This study has provided intriguing insights into the internal community organization at Kolomoki, perhaps literally a village of villages. Thank you.